Today I thought we could take a look at the various pre-order options for Game 3, including ways that they've done it in the past and new methods they could use to do it for the next game. Get comfy and let's hop right into it.
Wow.
So just to start, let's break down all the things the pre-order bonuses have historically had in common. They were always faction packs, they were always for a chaotic faction, and they were both designed to be used in the game you were pre-ordering, though Norska failed spectacularly at that last point. Where they differed was in time frame. Norska preceded Total Warhammer 2 by a month and a half, while the Warriors of Chaos launched simultaneously with the game and implementation. Again, Norska was supposed to be usable in both Game 1 and Game 2, even if they might have massively missed the mark on that part. Now, for our first pick, let's assume that literally every single one of those metrics still holds true. It'll be a faction pack, a chaotic faction at that, and be usable in Game 2 and Game 3. Well, then this particular entry becomes quite easy. There's only one faction that fits all those categories, and that's the Demons of Chaos. CA could implement them in the Vortex campaign extraordinarily easily. They have the most inspiration to wipe out the Vortex, even more so than the core races of Game 2 do, yet they also fit perfectly into Game 3's map. And of course, they'd fit the other two metrics perfectly as well. They'd be a brand new faction, and a chaotic one at that. There's also the tiny detail of them helping out with the balance of good and evil in the Game 3 launch races, if CA still wants to stick to that same layout they've done for the previous two games. The reasoning against them being in the pre-order seems fairly obvious. They are one of the de facto remaining 8th edition armies, which means Game 3 would theoretically only have 2 wins left at launch. I personally don't find this to be a particularly noteworthy thing to break. The pre-order for Game 1 was the Warriors of Chaos, and they are a far more important faction of the setting than the Demons of Chaos were. Alright, but let's assume that both the previous pre-orders having been Chaos factions was just pure coincidence, and we'll remove that variable. Well, then that opens up quite a few more options for us, so we'll break these down into Game 2 Vortex and Game 3, as well as Mortal Empires and Game 3 options. Starting with the Vortex races, we've really only got one option, the Dogs of War. This mercenary faction could theoretically have an old world start position in the Southern Realms, as a lot of people tend to conflate the two, but it should be noted that the Dogs of War work absolutely everywhere, so they'd fit into Game 2's map just fine. Given how mobile the Dogs of War tend to be, and considering the overwhelming majority of their lineup is already created in other races, or at least will be used by Game 3 core races, they're among the easiest options left on the list. The Halflings also pop in as a minor faction possibility that I would personally love to see, but I don't imagine that they're very high up on the ratings for CA to worry about. What if the pre-order doesn't need to be present in the Vortex campaign though? Well, in theory this opens us up to almost any Game 3 race, but I'm going to remove 2 of them right off the outset, the Ogre Kingdoms and Kislev. The Ogre Kingdoms are pretty far east of the current Mortal Empires map, so they wouldn't really make too much sense to try and force into the old world. As for Kislev, if Kislev is picked instead, Game 3 won't have any good factions at launch, only evil ones, nor will they have a sort of standard faction choice. The Ogre Kingdoms, Chaos Dwarves, and Demons of Chaos are all super specialized in some aspects and fairly weak in others. And say what you want about the good and evil balance, but having a default race is one of those things I don't think Creative Assembly is willing to forgo at launch. It does, however, leave the Chaos Dwarves as a potential pre-order bonus, who could be used to easily fill in the upper right portion of the Mortal Empires map, which at the moment is just screaming insert Chaos Dwarves here. There is a second, unlikely option with Albion. The Truthsayers and or Dark Emissaries could both be in the old world right near Albion itself, while they could also both be firmly within the Game 3 map to either stop Chaos or help it respectively. They'd be a super cool option out of left field if CA went that way, but again, much like the Halflings, they're a very small faction and I don't imagine they're very high up on the scales of possibility. If we switch which map the pre-order should fit, Game 2's Vortex and Mortal Empires, but forgoing Game 3's map completely, then a new interesting race pops into the mix, the Amazons. They'd have a new world start position in Lustria and an old world start position that could put them almost anywhere CA felt like, such as Albion. They don't really make any sense to be in Game 3 unfortunately, but I've still seen quite a few people suggest them as an option, and to be perfectly honest, they are an option I'd be completely down with. Technically this also opens up Araby, but until I hear otherwise from CA, I am still assuming that they're a no-go. Then there's one final option for factions, which is that they'll simply skip Game 2 altogether and they will work exclusively in Game 3 instead. This would sidestep the issue that plagued Norska for months, and given how large of an update I think many of us are expecting for Game 3, it might be a similar consideration here. And it's not like it's without precedent. This is exactly how the Game 1 pre-order race worked, after all. It only worked in the game actually being pre-ordered. Going this route technically makes every single Game 3 race a potential race option, including the previously mentioned Ogre Kingdoms, Chaos Dwarves, and Demons of Chaos. I still really doubt Kislev would be the pre-order for the reasons I suggested earlier, and I would personally recommend that races such as Ind, Koresh, and Nippon are almost guaranteed to be a no-go. But in theory, the Noblar Hordes, Hobgoblin Khanate, and even Cathay could be used as a pre-order bonus without issue if we open it up like this. Alright, but let's shake up our variables once again and remove the last rule. We'll make the faction component completely irrelevant so that anything goes. Well, now we have a boatload of options left. A Lord pack, however, would seem offensively small to me unless it's incredibly special in some way. So let's narrow our choices down and say that it needs to be way above and beyond a normal Lord pack, just to help trim off the litany of Lord pack options available. We'll start with two major characters, ones that people would actually be fairly happy with even just on their own, Thinkwell and Nagash. The former has one colossal strike against it in my eyes though. CA has already said that they would use him in Game 3. In theory, this would still hold somewhat true if we kind of smudged the lines a little, as using him as a pre-order bonus, he would still sort of tie in with Game 3, but he still strikes me as incredibly unlikely for several more reasons. In spite of what I've said before, the Skaven don't really need a rework just yet, at least not in comparison to Game 1 races, and to have him hot on the heels of another DLC would be incredibly frustrating for a lot of players. Alright, but then what about the big bone daddy himself, Nagash? Well, he actually kind of makes sense. The factions that could recruit him are mostly in the Old World and New World, and many of his subjects already exist in those same maps, and he could also be put further east without any issues at all either. I know there's a lot of players hoping to see him, and as much as I would personally prefer to see him used as a grand threat in Game 3, pre-orders would fly off the digital shelves for the chance to play him early. On top of that, the Vampire Counts' previous rework kinda sucked, especially when compared to the Empire and Greenskin reworks, so CA could try to bundle in a new rework for the Vampire Counts to help promote value in something like that. But then speaking of reworks, let's take a look at the other way CA could make a Lord pack worthwhile as a pre-order, that being with reworks. Now, we can immediately take a bunch of races off the list. The Empire, Greenskins, Wood Elves, High Elves, Dark Elves, Skaven, Lizardmen, Tomb Kings, and Vampire Coast are all already up to Game 2 standards, so giving them a rework now would be a colossal slap in the face for fans of the older races still waiting for a decent gameplay experience. That limits us to the Vampire Counts, Dwarves, Warriors of Chaos, Beastmen, and Norska. We're going to go in order here, starting with the Vamps. As I said, they could use Nagash, but there's also the opportunity to implement some of the other bloodlines, with the Lamians, Blood Dragons, Necrarchs, and Strigoi all being brutally obvious gaps to fill, to say nothing of the minor bloodlines. And if Nagash does turn out to be a focal point of Game 3, updating his most well-known followers would seem rather pressing to do beforehand. The Dwarves, much like the Counts, got an extremely unsatisfying update that did almost nothing to bring them up to the standards of Game 2. And given that their well-known evil kin are going to be a part of Game 3, again it might be in CA's best interest to make them actually fun to play through an update before Game 3 launches. While they have a number of named characters left, it might be worth looking at an Engineer or a Rune Lord, which still leaves a boatload of options, though I'd personally suggest that fan favorites such as Malachi Mycosyn, Thoric Ironbrow, Grim Burlock Sun, and Craig the Grim are likely to be on the shortlist, and yes, pun was 100% intentional on that. The Warriors of Chaos and the Beastmen are two factions that both share the same flaw. They're hordes in a game where horde armies are, without exception, the least enjoyable way to play. Now, we've seen CA toy with how to fix horde faction armies, though so far they've never quite stuck the landing. And because they both suffer the same issue, I'd personally argue that the fix for both could be done on this same update, presuming of course that the Beastmen don't get their update first in a Lord pack. I'd suggest there's more reasons to do this as well, given the suspicious timing of the Savage Edition for the first game, and there'd be an almost poetic element to fixing the first pre-order bonus by using the last pre-order bonus. However, as said, CA might fix the Beastmen anyways with an upcoming Lord pack, and if that's the case, then we'd swap out their update in exchange for Norska's. Norska had the single roughest launch in all of Total Warhammer's history, with a fairly buggy launch, a failure to fit into both games after being announced that it would, delays, and just general confusion from many players. It stands out as the biggest regret for some of the developers, according to an older Reddit AMA. I would imagine that the chance to fix both pre-orders with the final pre-order would be something of a moral win for CA, and I really can't imagine any players being upset at the prospect of having every chaotic faction freshly updated for the launch of Game 3, given the assumed theme of that game will likely be around the end times. Now, there's also the final option that CA might do some sort of crazy campaign thing, such as like a weather system, or naval battles, new maps, the siege updater, one of any number of general fixes, though I'm personally of the opinion that anything along those lines is likely going to wait for Game 3, rather than trying to force those systems into Game 2 and likely breaking everyone's saves and mods. But from the list of potential options, which do I think is most likely? Well, for me, I don't think we're seeing a Lord Pack pre-order bonus. It'd be inappropriate even under normal circumstances, but given the expected 4-year wait between Game 2 and 3, it'd be downright offensive for that to be the response. So for me, there's only a few options left that I consider truly in the running. Dogs of War, Demons of Chaos, Chaos Dwarves, and Amazons. All of them have something about them that feels wrong to me, but even then, they still stand heads and shoulders above the other options. If you really put a gun to my head and made me pick, I'd say the Dogs of War are the most likely choice in my eyes, followed by the Amazons, and then the Chaos Dwarves, and then finally the Demons of Chaos. But that's it for this one. So who do you think is the most likely pre-order bonus and why? Let me know down below, and please be nice to each other. Remember, it's just everyone's opinion. As always, I want to thank you so much for spending time with me, and I'll see you all next time.